a king, the most powerful throne in the world, and a woman who wasn't supposed to exist. In 1936, one man made a choice that shattered an empire, rewrote royal law, and changed the course of World War II itself. But what if everything you've been told about the greatest love story of the century was a lie? What if it wasn't about love at all? This is the story of King Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson, the scandal that broke Britain, the fairy tale they sold you. A king so deeply in love, he sacrificed his crown for the woman of his dreams. The truth buried in classified files. A constitutional nightmare, political betrayal, and secret letters that reveal a romance entangled with one of history's darkest regimes. Tonight, we're pulling back the velvet curtain on the British monarchy's most forbidden chapter. The questions we'll answer. Why did a king with absolute power choose exile over duty? What did Wallis Simpson really want? And why did the British government work so hard to keep them silent, even after abdication? Because what you're about to discover isn't just romance. It's espionage, conspiracy, and a cover-up that reaches all the way to Nazi Germany. Let's rewind to 1894. Edward Albert Christian, George Andrew Patrick David, known simply as David to his family, was born into the House of Windsor, destined for a life of privilege, parties, and little responsibility. He wasn't supposed to be king. His father, George V, was a stern, traditional man who believed in duty above all else. Edward? He was the opposite. Charming, reckless, a playboy who detested royal protocol and craved freedom. He toured the world as the Prince of Wales, became a media darling, and broke hearts across continents. Women adored him. The public worshipped him. But behind closed palace doors, his father was terrified. George V once said to his prime minister, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months." He was right. In January 1936, King George IV died, and Edward VIII ascended the throne. At 41 years old, he was now the King of the United Kingdom, Emperor of India, and head of the largest empire the world had ever seen. But he had a secret, a woman named Wallis Simpson. Wallis. Warfield Simpson was everything the British establishment despised. She was American, twice divorced, sharp-tongued, and utterly unsuitable for royalty. Born in Baltimore in 1896, Wallis came from a modest background, nothing close to aristocracy. She married young, divorced, remarried, and by the early 1930s, she had charmed her way into London's elite social circles. That's where she met Edward. By 1934, they were inseparable. Edward showered her with jewels, attention, and devotion that bordered on obsession. He called her constantly, wrote her letters, canceled state duties to be with her. His staff was horrified. His family was furious. The Church of England? Appalled. Because here's the problem. The King of England was also the supreme governor of the Church of England, a church that forbade divorce. Wallis was still legally married to her second husband, Ernest Simpson. Even after her divorce, remarrying her would violate every religious and constitutional principle the monarchy stood for. But Edward didn't care. He wanted to marry her, and he wanted her to be queen. The British government said no. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin made it clear Parliament would never accept Wallis Simpson as queen. The Dominions, Canada, Australia, South Africa agreed. The church refused to bless it. Edward had two choices: give up Wallis or give up the throne. On December 11, 1936, after reigning for just 326 days, Edward VIII became the first British monarch in history to voluntarily abdicate. He addressed the nation in a radio broadcast heard by millions. "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." The world was stunned. A king had chosen love over empire. Romantic, right? But that's where the fairy tale ends. And the nightmare begins. Here's what they didn't tell you in history class. Edward and Wallis didn't just leave Britain quietly. They went on a tour to Nazi Germany. In October 1937, just months after his abdication, Edward and Wallis visited Adolf Hitler at his mountain retreat in Berchtesgaden. Photos exist. They're chilling. Edward gives the Nazi salute multiple times. He tours factories, meets SS officers, dines with high-ranking members of the Third Reich. Hitler called Edward a kindred spirit. Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary, "The Duke is clearly pro-German. If he had remained king, we would have been able to avoid war." Wait, what? Let's dig deeper. Evidence. 1. The Marburg Files. After World War II, Allied forces discovered thousands of classified documents in Germany. Among them, secret telegrams between the Duke of Windsor, Edward's new title, and Nazi officials. These documents revealed that Edward had been in regular contact with German diplomats even after Britain declared war on Germany in 1939. In one telegram, a Nazi diplomat wrote, "The Duke believes that continued severe bombing will make England ready for peace." Translation: Edward thought Germany should keep bombing Britain to force a surrender. Evidence number 2. Operation Willi in 1940. Nazi intelligence devised a plan called Operation Willi, a plot to kidnap or coerce Edward into becoming a puppet king if Germany successfully invaded Britain. Hitler believed Edward could be installed as a Nazi-friendly monarch, legitimizing German occupation. The British government found out. They were terrified, so they did something extraordinary. They exiled Edward again. This time to the Bahamas, a tiny, irrelevant British colony thousands of miles from Europe. He was made governor, but it was a gilded cage. He was being kept out of the way. Evidence. There are 3. Wallis Simpson's background declassified MI5 files reveal that British intelligence had been watching Wallis for years. Why? Because she had close ties to Joachim von Ribbentrop, Nazi Germany's foreign minister. Rumors swirled. Some even suggested Wallis had been his lover when he served as ambassador to London in the early 1930s. Von Ribbentrop allegedly sent her 17 carnations every day. 17, the number of times, according to palace gossip, they had been intimate. True or not, one thing is clear: Wallis had German connections, and so did Edward. But hold on. Not everyone believes Edward was a Nazi sympathizer. Royal historians argue that Edward was politically naive, a man who didn't understand the implications of his actions. He wanted peace, not war. And his visit to Germany? Just a misguided attempt at diplomacy. After all, many European aristocrats in the 1930s admired Hitler's economic recovery in Germany. Appeasement was official British policy at the time. Edward's defenders say he was used, manipulated, that Wallis, ambitious and cunning, pushed him toward dangerous alliances for her own social climbing. Some even claim the British government exaggerated his Nazi ties to justify keeping him in exile, so maybe it was all a misunderstanding. Maybe Edward really was just a lovesick fool, or maybe the British royal family knew something we still don't. Because here's the thing, the royal archives have never released Edward's full correspondence. Even today, nearly 90 years later, certain files about Edward VIII remain classified. Why? What are they hiding? In 2017, a batch of previously sealed letters was released. They contained more evidence of Edward's sympathy toward Nazi Germany, including his belief that bombing England into submission would bring peace faster. The royal family was horrified. They ordered the letters resealed for another 100 years. And Wallis? Her FBI file, yes, she had one, revealed that American intelligence believed she was passing information to the Germans through Spanish intermediaries. Was she a spy, a manipulator, or just a woman caught in the wrong place at the wrong time? We may never know, but one thing is certain. Edward's abdication wasn't just about love, it was about power, politics, and a dangerous infatuation with fascism that nearly cost Britain the war. Here's where it gets wild. Some historians believe that if Edward had remained king, Britain would have lost World War II. Think about it. Nazi-sympathizing king on the British throne, refusing to support Churchill's war effort, possibly negotiating a separate peace with Hitler, leaving France and the Allies to collapse Hitler's plan. Wasn't just military conquest, it was psychological, cultural. He wanted to install sympathetic leaders across Europe, and Edward VIII, beloved, charismatic, weak-willed, would have been the perfect puppet. The theory goes like this. Edward's abdication wasn't romantic. It was a constitutional assassination. The British establishment, MI5, Parliament, the royal family, realized Edward was a security threat, so they engineered his downfall. They used Wallis Simpson as the weapon. They made the marriage politically impossible, forced him to choose, knowing he'd choose her, and when he did, they exiled him, silenced him, and ensured he could never return to power. It wasn't love that cost Edward his throne. It was treason, disguised as a love story. This isn't the first time a king chose the wrong side of history for a woman. Think of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, a Roman general who abandoned his empire for an Egyptian queen only to lose everything. Or Helen of Troy, a love so dangerous it launched 1,000 ships and burned a civilization to the ground. Throughout history, powerful men have been undone by their obsessions. But Edward's story is different, because unlike the myths, this one is real, and it almost handed the world to the Nazis. Edward and Wallis lived the rest of their lives in exile. Paris, New York, the Bahamas, always exiled, always watched. Wallis never became queen. She was never accepted by the royal family. Even after Edward's death in 1972, she was barely acknowledged. She died alone in 1986, bitter and forgotten. Their love story? It didn't end in triumph, it ended in isolation, suspicion, and regret. Edward's younger brother, George VI, became king instead, and led Britain through its darkest hour. His daughter? Queen Elizabeth II. The woman who would become the longest reigning monarch in British history. The woman who restored dignity to a throne her uncle nearly destroyed. So what's the truth? Historians remain divided. The romantic view: Edward was a man ahead of his time. He valued personal happiness over duty. His only crime was loving the wrong woman. The political view: Edward was a security liability. His Nazi sympathies were real. The establishment had no choice but to remove him. The conspiracy view: Edward was set up. The marriage crisis was manufactured to get rid of a king who threatened the war effort. Which do you believe? Here's the real question. What if the greatest love story of the 20th century wasn't about love at all? What if it was about power, manipulation, a king too weak to see he was being used? And what if the British monarchy, knowing all of this, chose to let the world believe in the fairy tale because a romantic tragedy sells better than treason? So I'll leave you with this. Was Edward VIII a romantic hero who gave up everything for love? Or was he a Nazi sympathizer whose obsession nearly cost the world its freedom? What do you believe? Drop your theory in the comments. Share this video. And let's uncover the truth together, because history isn't always what they teach you. Sometimes the greatest love stories are the greatest lies. Subscribe for more forbidden histories, the secrets buried by kings, the scandals erased by time, the truths they never wanted you to know. History has always whispered its darkest secrets. The real question is, are you ready to listen?